Hey everybody, welcome back to Sounds Like a Drum, Cadence independent media production. Today, we're talking about muffling. Specifically, is it possible that we don't really need it? Can we get all the sounds that we ever need without ever putting any muffling on the drums? There is a lot of wiggle room between muffled sounds and unmuffled sounds. The Venn diagram has a lot of crossover, but we've been really shocked at how really black and white and partisan opinions have been about whether or not we should be purists and completely forget about muffling entirely, including the bass drum and everywhere, versus people who are entirely dependent on muffling to get the sound that they need and almost don't sweat the tuning really at all. What we decided to do today was give ourselves a little bit of a challenge and start out with a great sounding, definitely aggressively muffled kit all around, and then check out what that sounded like when we took off all those things and see how close we could then get to what we started with without any muffling at all. Without further ado, the muffled sounds. As per usual, in case you're curious, no compression, no EQ, nothing like that in post. This is just the drums and the muffling. For the muffling, we decided to go with a bit of a mixed bag. All of our favorites are represented here. We have a bandana on the snare drum, a big pillow in the bass drum, some gaff tape on the rack tom, and an E-ring on the floor tom. Also, just to show you that you don't have to have the same muffling on everything. Depending on the sound you're after, and since we are sound-oriented, we chose these things. There are a lot of reasons why people choose to add muffling. I think definitely for me, I think of it as a sculpting of the sound kind of thing. In some cases with the snare drum, a specific sound that happens with a specific kind of muffling that I recreate often. In this case, the low-tuned snare drum with the bandana across the entire head. What we ended up doing today effectively is applying different kinds of techniques to muffling the drums in an effort to recreate sounds that, as we mentioned earlier, have to do also with post-production. You can think of muffling and this sort of general distribution of extra mass on the drums as both a kind of EQing and a kind of compression that takes us to hearing only certain parts of the drums that we use all of this extra stuff to accentuate while taking away sort of ancillary stuff that we don't want and just boosting the bits that we do. Now we're going to pull away all the muffling, including the pillow and the bass drum, but we're not going to change any tuning or tension anywhere at all so that you can see the effect of the muffling that we were using. So that's pretty janky. The snare drum is tough. I was earlier with the bandana on there playing in the center without catching the rim, and I did this again with the no muffling setup. A lot of overtones, a lot of crosstalk everywhere, a lot of wobbliness in general, and the bass drum is a cannon now. One of the things that's really useful about muffling drums that are already sort of tuned for projection and for resonance and warmth is that you can then have all of this material sonically to sculpt with the muffling. It's not about taking ugly sounding drums and making them sound good. Instead, in this case, it was about getting a lot of tone out of the drums and then just sort of shaving away the bits that we didn't want so that we could keep the warmth and the fatness and also the shortness of those parts of the sound. Now we're going to take a crack at tuning everything, trying some different tricks and techniques to see if we can get a good, usable, dead, muffled sound out of the drums without adding any muffling of any kind, just tuning. Now, if you've been with the show for any length of time, we know by now that what we do here is talk about getting great sounds out of drums. We are capable of tuning these drums and other drums to get fabulous sounds out of them. It is really difficult, if not impossible, to match acoustically the sound of tuned drums that sound good with muffling added to them. We went after figuring out how to get short, concise, punchy sounds out of the drums here without adding anything to them. And there's really nothing that we can do about the overtones, about the crosstalk, about the fact that I have to tune the resos on the toms incorrectly, which is to say taking a couple of the lugs almost all the way out to get them to not sustain so much and get into that punchy place that's super easy to get with just a little bit of muffling on the batter head and a very small amount of muffling on the reso. In terms of specific adjustments that I made, starting with the snare, I raised the tension on the batter a little bit, and I lowered the tension on the snare side. The effect of this is to broaden the note and to shorten the sustain because there's less tension on the reso head to throw the tone back into the batter, making for sustain and accentuating overtones around the edge and also in the center. For the rack tom and the floor tom both, I raised the batters a little bit, I lowered the resos a little bit, and then I worked with the resos to basically make them fight the drum a little bit, because if they're in tune with themselves, no matter where they are in their range, they're going to resonate. That's why they're called the reso head. In a situation like this, particularly with modern drums, but indeed with any, if the reso's doing its job, you're going to be getting some beautiful acoustic tone out of it. So figuring out a tuning scheme for the bottom where it is actually dissonant with itself just a little bit can shorten the sustain, in addition to lowering its tension overall so that it's not bringing so much energy back into the batter, resulting in sustain. Lastly, with the bass drum, I raised the reso head pitch a little bit and then backed one of the lugs entirely out, similarly to what I was doing with the toms, to get it to fight itself a little bit. It's already fighting itself a little because it has a port, but we needed a little bit more. On the batter side, I lowered the tension of the head entirely to where it was basically just above a wrinkle, pretty much finger tight. Again, thinking in terms of not wanting to be able to activate that head too much and turn it into a drum that sounds like it has a lot of sustain. It's worth noting also that the batter head on the bass drum is an Evans UV EMAD, which has a muffle ring built into it. A lot of people believe that a pre-muffled EMAD or other heads that come with some muffling attached make it so that you don't need to put anything in the drum ever. They'll swear that you can just put that head on there and you're good to go. Obviously, that's not the case. It's not that it sounds bad with nothing in the drum, but it does not sound the same as if there's a pillow in it. So throwing the pillow out completely is selling ourselves short of all of the other options, even if we are using this style of batter head. The overall effect of all of this is that I had to lower the resos so much in order to get the sustain that I was looking for essentially to go away, that it resulted in not enough tone in the toms, the snare, and still actually kind of a lot of tone in the bass drum in a weird roundabout way. I really couldn't mimic what happened when the drums were resonating really effectively, and then we added muffling to them to just kind of square that up and make them super punchy. The net result is that we have to understand that muffling is not just a prescription for bad tuning, and great tuning is no substitute for muffling if the situation calls for that kind of sound. Both of these schemes and everything in between have their place, and if we can just bring ourselves to a mental state where we can treat it all as options rather than some side of this being dogma that we have to follow, the whole world opens up to us, from ultra muffled, totally dead, to wide open and sustainy and beautiful. Listening back to that just now, I realize I'm calling one of them dead and I'm calling one of them beautiful. And already these semantics are messing with the message, which is that they're all good. And there are really ugly wide open sounds and there are really beautiful muffled sounds. And already we have these words in the lexicon when we talk about the drums. That in itself is already kind of problematic. This idea that muffling is a prescription for an issue even comes up when you talk about really high-end or really expensive, or both, drum sets, and the idea that you paid all this money for this great wood and all this craftsmanship. How dare you put tape on that snare drum? How dare you put a pillow in the bass drum? If we are out to make music and the goal is sound, then you should do whatever you need to do to get that sound. And if that sound is a really junky drum set with old heads on it, awesome. If it's a $6,000 drum set with rings on it, hey, if it works, it works. There's no rules here. And the closer we can get to believing that, the more options there are going to be. Just, you got to stop worrying about those things. The bottom line here is that muffling is a tool. It's not always used for good. Sometimes it is a thing that has to get used in a pinch, or it might be a remedy for a person struggling with tuning a certain drum or tuning in general. But just like a drum key, it's so useful with a little bit of practice, a little bit of understanding, and one is not a substitute for the other. It's very important that we understand tuning. It's also very important that we understand the effects of amounts and styles of muffling, the same way that we might have an extra snare drum or anything else. It's options, it's tools, it's things to help us make music, to innovate, to make better, interesting, different, inspirational sounds, and to keep us frankly excited about the instrument too. Anything that we just say is garbage and throw it away, all of those things have possibilities in them and they are worth exploring. And that brings us to the end. Thank you so much for watching all of that. This is a really important one to me because I am really intense about tuning. I also care a lot about judicious muffling. I hope it's given you some ideas as well. We talk about this stuff here all the time, and it's all about just keeping an open mind. Speaking of, please like, comment, and subscribe, and click the notification bell and check out our other videos. We have a lot to offer in terms of myth busting and ideas like this. We have a lot also over on the Patreon. Please follow the link below and check that out. In addition to the Cymbals series on the Patreon, we're also going to have all of the extended demos from today's extended performances. And at the Dynasonic level and above, we're also going to A/B with mixed and raw audio so you can hear some of the options that you have when you start with these sounds and then start to get into some production. Finally, we would really love to know your relationship to muffling, especially if you really lean on it a lot or if you are absolutely against it. If you fall on one or the other side of those extremes, how did you come to that? And if you have certain situations where you cross that border, we would love to know that too.